This is a quick tour of distance learning and instructional design and an examination of how history, technology, and theory have intertwined to create instructional design as we know it today. We begin our tour shortly after the birth of a brand new nation that had just broken away from British rule. The brand new government passed the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which expanded lands for settlement into the Northwest region around the Great Lakes, and it also facilitated federal land grants for education purposes. And this was significant because the government was acknowledging that an educated populace is necessary for democracy to succeed. And it wasn't too long before the first university was founded, which was American Western University in 1802, which was later renamed as Ohio University in 1804. Now that we have a precedent to prioritize public education, you had the formation of the Common School, and these emerged in the 1820s as a standard approach to education with the common curriculum. Think about the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. This significantly raised literacy rates, so it became part of our culture that most everyone in the populace knew how to read. So it became more common to keep a journal, to read, and in general to take in new information via reading. The next stop on our tour is the Lyceum movement, which was founded in 1826, and it quickly grew in popularity as both a movement for education and arts and entertainment, and it became a popular way to spread around ideas, thoughts, opinions, and culture. During the Civil War, the Morrill Act, much like the Northwest Ordinance, provided land grants for schools, particularly for colleges and universities serving mechanical and agricultural students. Next, we have the Chautauqua movement, which started in 1874 and quickly grew popular. Much like the Lyceum movement, you had traveling lecturers, but the interesting thing about the Chautauqua movement was that you could actually get a degree through Chautauqua. In fact, around this time, Extension Services brought education out to rural areas, so out where farmers were hungry for this sort of information, they could actually get to it. In fact, one great example was the University of Chicago in 1892 was the first time a school had set up an external degree program. So you could actually go to school and get a degree without physically being there, all by correspondence. In the early 1900s, you had a number of emerging technologies that were making it easier to spread information around. First, you had the railroad, which combined with the telegraph made correspondence education much easier. To name a few more, you had cars and planes, radio, and by 1928 you had television, and by 1929 silent films became talkies when they were able to add an audio track. In 1939, World War II began, with the U.S. joining the war in 1941. All of a sudden, the United States needed well-trained troops fast. A man named Frank Capra got involved and created movies to make propaganda and training videos. This was the first use of technology to reach a mass audience, and may even be considered the first use of instructional design and technology. This introduced concepts such as sequence, narrative pacing, and linear delivery through technology. By 1948, instructional design was more commonly recognized as an educational approach, with a corresponding rise of theory related to instructional design. For example, the behaviorism approach with drill and kill, sequencing, pacing, practice were very compatible with the video approach. And by 1950, you even had broadcast distance education through Morning Semester, which was a television program to learn math, in which you could even get a type of certification. By the early 50s and 60s, we start to see the formation and growth of some early distance education theories, starting with Skinner's behaviorism, which you could see applied with technology through computer-assisted instruction and experiments, which were heavy in behaviorism because they used a lot of practice, assessment, and feedback. Whereas the 60s gave rise to Bruner's cognitive approach, which represented a change in focus in instructional design because this started to consider the higher level thinking involved in learning and what actually takes place while we are learning in the brain. And you could see this was being utilized in Seymour Papert's MIT Logo program, in which children were using devices to play, experiment, and reflect on cause and effect. As we move from the 60s and into the 70s and 80s, we start to see theory and technology evolve even further, such as the DARPA and ARPANET technologies, which laid the technical foundation for the internet, and even the first microcomputer. Email appeared in the early 70s, and nonlinear solutions became available through technology such as laserdiscs, which allowed learners some control over choice of sequence. And very importantly, you start to see instructional design researched as a science in and of itself, with Gagne's Conditions of Learning and a book he released called Principles of Instructional Design as some examples. Some other examples that emerged in the 70s were Michael Moore's discussion of the transactional distance, in which he argued for reducing physical distance, not literally, but at least psychologically, through an instructional dialogue. And similarly, Holmberg's discussion of a guided didactic conversation, which he later termed as the teaching-learning conversation, which focuses on empathy. And both of these discussions concentrated more on creating a dialogue and creating a conversation in order to increase learning motivation and learning outcomes. As we enter the 90s and start to work our way up to the present, we enter the period of time that I like to refer to as the boom. This is the period of time in which technology and theory are exploding. Because first we had the birth of the internet in 1989, and from there it was a snowball effect of both technology and theory, with massive open online courses, also known as MOOCs, social networking such as MySpace, Facebook, YouTube, and the list goes on and on. There are tons of studies and experiments exploring internet-based education, building off all of the classic theories, plus finding whole new ways that we can now think about education with the access to technology that we have now. This rethinking involves a movement from deterministic approaches to more emergent approaches that are more adaptive and learner-centered. After working our way through the history of instructional design and technology and distance education, one has to wonder what comes next. It could be that some teleconferencing capabilities become ever more sophisticated, or the future of distance education may look more like a production studio than a classroom, as is already being tried out at Harvard University, in which students all over the world tune in live to an instructor give his lecture and participate in class discussions. While this means some of them may have to be up at 3 in the morning, this could represent a shift in instructional design and distance education that allows for more social interaction, even at a distance. We can't know what comes next, but let's have fun making it happen.